Hello everybody, happy Monday. Welcome to another episode of Learn with Flo, especially after taking a week off last week to recharge and kind of rejuvenate myself with some time in Sedona. If you are following my stories, you got to kind of follow along on all of my hiking adventures and outdoorsy stuff that we got to do there, which was great. And so getting back into the office this week, getting back into the routine means getting back to our Monday Learn with Flo sessions and welcoming kind of a new month. And it definitely feels like a new season too, because fall, depending on where you're at, has definitely sprung here in the Omaha area. So you can see me kind of sporting my sweater weather now. And I just feel like anytime there's kind of like a changing of the seasons, there's also, different other changes that come with it, right? Change of routine, change of appetite. And we kind of get to understand like what's kind of our norm, what's our habit, what do we kind of gravitate towards during this time of the year, and is that something that we want to be part of our normal routine, right? And so I really think with the changing of the seasons, it makes sense to then loop in a lot of awareness really around our day-to-day routine and what we want that routine to look like heading into a new month and a new breath of fresh air. So as you guys know, a lot of our conversations here with our Learn with Flo is your opportunity to kind of get a more long format opportunity to dialogue with me about different questions that come up either in my one-on-one client sessions behind the scenes, or even questions that come up through daily conversations, through social media, through different posts. And I think a really big general theme that I have seen as of late really comes around this like silent struggle that I see, especially in women's health and hormones, and that is this silent struggle of under eating. So we're going to really dive into that today. We're going to talk about the science of under eating. How do we define under eating? Because I think a lot of times I call it the silent struggle for a reason, because most of the time, very few of us really actually know that we're under fueling. And I think even with the prominence of diet culture these days, we're getting farther and farther away from recognizing what it looks like to fuel ourselves adequately on a daily basis, not just with quantity, but like under fueling and under eating can also be a quality conversation, right? So that's what we'll get to kind of talk about today, where a lot of people are like, oh, surely I'm like eating too much because I have a weight loss resistance picture, or, I can't lose the last 10 pounds. And it's like, but is it always just I'm eating too much? And we immediately jump into this calorie conversation. And that doesn't usually do a woman's body very much good, right? It adds a lot of stress, which we've talked about in the past. And that stress can then blend into a ton of different downstream issues when it comes to hormone balance. So especially when it comes to a woman's body, there's a lot more sensitivity there to underfueling patterns. And again, not just underfueling when we talk about like calories, right? Which is where everybody's brain wants to go. And I'm not saying that it's not important to think about like overall energy intake, but when I think about underfueling, it's also like, are we underfueling certain macronutrients like protein or fiber? Are we underfueling certain micronutrients like minerals or vitamins, right? So it's not just an underfueling sheer from amount of like calorie intake, but it's more like, are we like overfeeding but undernourished, right? In some aspects can also even define an underfueling picture. So I say this and I wanted to bring this up as a conversation and really dive into it, because I think that there is a huge misunderstanding about like what under eating actually is. So I really want to define that so that individuals can kind of come to the table and start to recognize like, is that me? Is that something that I'm struggling with too? And also recognizing some of the signs and the symptoms of underfueling. And we're going to dive into quite a bit today, because I don't want to just talk about like the physical signs and symptoms of underfueling, which I think help us like start to recognize whether we fall into that category or not. But I also want to talk about the social, the emotional, the psychological types of symptoms that come from a chronic underfueling pattern as well too, because it plays a lot into even just like that psycho-neurological type of connection as well too. So lots to unpack and kind of dig into here. And I wanted to bring this conversation to the forefront because there's a really common theme here of specifically women getting duped into this kind of underfueling scene with diet culture these days, right? So diet culture is really, really steeped in the whole eat less, move more, calories in, calories out. There's a lot of different strategies, different protocols, different diets that really just get at the same exact thing, which is in some way, shape, or form restricting overall food intake from one method or another, right? So we'll kind of talk about that a little bit today. But I also think that there's a lot of women, especially women that come to me and we get to have those conversations kind of one-on-one. They don't even realize until we have that conversation together that they are under eating, right? They're like, oh, I didn't even recognize that the breakfast that I was having on a daily basis is actually just a snack. It's like, yeah, that's a snack. That's not really what our body would deem as like a suitable meal for the next 3, 4, 5 hours. And when we don't have that consistent and steady and reliable source of fuel coming in, then our body does not feel safe in any way, shape, or form offloading fuel, right? Which is essentially what like stored body fat is extra fuel on board, right? And so it's like, if a body doesn't feel safe to offload fuel, why in the heck would it be in a position where it's worried about losing weight or losing body fat or changing body composition, right? So when we think about this, like this under eating pattern, I call it a silent struggle because a lot of women don't recognize how big of an influence it's really making in terms of their health, their hormones, and their daily symptoms. So working with thousands of women now at this point, I have noticed more and more that undereating is a culprit of a lot of functional hormonal issues, gut issues as well. And most are accidentally doing it, but nonetheless, it's a real issue that needs to be considered when we're experiencing kind of a cluster of different hormonal health issues, or what I would call like mystery health symptoms. That is a very common population of people that I work with, is individuals that have sought out maybe some traditional medicine approaches for some of their symptoms, and they're not finding relief and not finding answers. And so then they end up more in the functional realm with myself, and we're able to connect the dots of how a lot of these symptoms that they're experiencing actually are together, right? They're influenced by each other when we start to trace it back to like the root of the root of the root of the cause, right? And often one of the very first things that we have to address, at least we have to take it off the table, is a chronic underfueling pattern, right? Now, this isn't a open season blessing to just eat your way out of house and home. No, it is a very intentional pattern of making sure that we recognize what that actually looks like to fuel ourselves properly in a given day, right? It's not just this, oh, permission to just eat more to eat more. It's like, no, it's very strategic. Like, what do I want you eating more of? What do we want to include more of? How do we plan and be very purposeful about these additions to our day-to-day, whether it's when we're eating or how we're eating, or pairing certain foods together. So when I think about some of the main like signs and symptoms that really stand out to me, and I want to relay to you guys as well too, that help me kind of tip off this whole potential underfueling type pattern, we're going to really see kind of some hallmark signs and symptoms here. So number one is what I would call a weight loss resistance picture, or like your body never changes, right? No matter what you do. You've tried the whole like eat less, move more, macro track, try this workout routine, try that workout routine, and nothing really moves. So no matter how much you diet or exercise, your body stays exactly the same, or it even like creeps up, right? So that's a pretty classic symptom there of like, maybe the whole like eat less, move more thing isn't working for you because your body's adapted to a certain energy balance or a certain energy load, or what you're eating, how you're eating is causing a stress, a perceived stress to your body, and causing it to really hold on to some of that excess energy. It doesn't feel safe letting that go, right? So a classic weight loss resistance picture, which I know sounds super counterintuitive, but underfueling can happen at any body size. That is a very like common, and I wish would just like die misnomer in more of like the health related field, is that anybody that has a weight loss resistance picture is just straight up eating too much. And that's not always the case. Sometimes there can also be some significant like gut and micronutrient deficiencies and things like that at play as well too. Number 2 is you are chronically constipated, bloated, or you have what you would consider like horrible digestive patterns. Undereating really does cause a lot of suppression of things like digestive enzymes, stomach acid production, which is just a perfect recipe for bloating. If there's not enough food coming in, then there's not going to be enough food coming out the other end, obviously. So that can also lead to chronic constipation, which then can lead to dysbiosis patterns and overgrowths in the gut because we want to keep things moving along. Otherwise, we get some bacterial overgrowths in the gut that can then cause more downstream issues as well too. So chronically constipated, bloating, kind of having this horrible digestion picture can also be some classic signs of underfueling as well. We also see this kind of just sluggish metabolism picture, or what we would call like kind of tired all of the time, a chronic fatigue picture, even after adequate amount of sleep, still feeling like always fatigued, right? So we have to think food is energy, and food is a combination of different nutrients that drive all of the energetic pathways that happen in our body. So food without enough food on board, or under eating or inadequate energy intake, we can't really expect to create energy like out of nothing, right? So that's where I think too, a lot of times individuals, they get into that mode of like, oh, I'm just gonna like cut my calories, and all they end up on the other end is like more tired, more bloated, more constipated, but their weight didn't really budge. It's like, okay, so is this just like cut calories type of conversation? We can suppress a lot of hormone function, mitochondrial function, especially thyroid function at that aspect as well too. Other signs, especially for women, is when or if our period goes missing, or we start to get some infertility struggles. Low progesterone, or what we call hypothalamic amenorrhea, can happen with that chronic underfueling picture, or really what we call in scientific terms like low energy availability. That will signal back to the brain that the body is not safe. It is not a safe environment in which to get pregnant or to bring offspring into the world. If the body doesn't feel safe to do that, it's going to try to down-regulate that fertility type cycle. So missing periods and ovulatory cycles, inconsistent cycles, or just infertility in general can be signs of some underfueling. Also, classic signs is if you don't have an appetite. Also can play in on the other end of the spectrum if you kind of have like an insatiable appetite too. So both ends of the spectrum of just kind of feeling some extreme appetite spectrum, whether it's not feeling hungry at all and kind of losing touch with some of those natural hunger fullness cues, or kind of like insatiable hunger, can both indicate that like underfueling pattern, because we have kind of hijacked our hunger hormones, leptin and ghrelin, and we're not getting adequate feedback loop to the brain anymore because of those more inconsistent fueling patterns, or that stress response that underfueling can create as well too. And then I think the last kind of major sign and symptom that I identify is when we think about food all of the time. That's a pretty big one. And I know sometimes it's hard to kind of compare your experience to others, but in a normal sense, it's like, oh, am I able to eat my meal and then I feel full, satiated, focused for the next 4 hours without thinking about food, right? My body's not alarming me to I'm hungry. I'm not ruminating about like, what am I going to eat next? And like, all of that kind of like cravings and obsessive thoughts about food. That can be a sign that our brain, being hardwired for survival, is trying to upregulate some of those hunger signals so that you actually eat, right? So weight loss resistance, digestive issues, chronic fatigue, infertility or wonky menstrual cycles, lack of appetite, or obsessing over food can all kind of be signs and symptoms of an under-eating pattern, right? Not all of them, but those are kind of the ones that can be at least immediately kind of identified. So if you feel like you correlate to or relate to any of those, stay tuned, because there's even deeper ones that come up when we think about like emotional, social, outside of even just the physical and hormonal influences, like some of the chronic dangers of being in this underfueling pattern for quite some time. So in order to kind of if we feel that, yeah, that might be me, I kind of suspect I either have had bouts of chronic underfueling in the past, or I think I'm still currently underfueling based off of, different past diets that I've tried and different food rules that have been stuck into my head. Like, I feel like I don't have a really good grasp on what it really looks like to fuel myself properly. That would be someone that would be a really good candidate to start to dig into, like, what do we define as under eating, right? So sometimes if you kind of feel like, I may fit this picture, but like, how do I really know? I think there's multiple different types of underfueling patterns. It doesn't have to be just straight up intentional underfueling. Like I said, this is sometimes like a silent struggle for women. They don't really know that they're doing it, or it's like more of an unintentional underfueling pattern. So the first thing that I want to make clear when we're defining kind of what underfueling is again, I'm going to go back to it time and time again, is that undereating can happen at any body size. It is not size inclusive. It doesn't mean that you have to be like stick skinny, eating disorder thin in order to be undereating. I have treated multiple hundreds of overweight and or obese individuals that are, in my definition, underfueling, or at least inconsistently fueling. So they have periods of underfueling and then periods of binging because of the chronic underfueling, right? So you can start to see, you're like, oh, so there's multiple definitions here of undereating than just like straight up anorexic, right? Or intentional restriction of food. So there's multiple different ways that undereating can manifest. The first one is probably the most obvious one, which would be more of that intentional food restriction or intentional dieting. And in the world of diet culture, let's be real, there is no shortage of different diets and different protocols that really promote straight up restriction. There's normally 3 different categories in which different diets restrict, although they all lead to the same end road. It's just a matter of like, how do you want to spin it? What type of like face do we want to put on it? But in the end, it's like, it's restriction, right? It's like, it's no different. There's just 1,000 different ways that different marketing ploys, different twists on different scientific studies and research have tried to put people in different camps of like, that there's a certain end-all be-all diet for everybody, right? But if we really, really look at it, high-level overview and how I tend to see and experience kind of like the nutrition and the diet world is that there's really 3 different types. Every single flippin' diet that you see out there really fits into one of 3 different categories, right? So if someone is kind of practicing more intentional food restriction, they're probably either under the category of like a dietary restriction model, which is demonizing or eliminating particular food groups based off of the quality of their food, right? So classic example would be like keto or carnivore that like demonizes carbohydrates, right? It's the same means to an end. They're getting you to demonize and eat less carbohydrates, therefore you eat less food overall, right? It's like same means to an end. You can put different shades of lipstick on a pig and it's still a pig, right? So we have dietary restriction, or you have some individuals that follow more calorie restriction, which is intentionally counting calories, measuring, tracking food quantity with the intention of, again, eating less food, creating caloric deficit. So same pig, right? Just different shades of lipstick. So the last one being more of a time restriction picture, where individuals are restricting or setting boundaries around certain feeding or fasting windows with the intention of eating fewer calories or energy overall. So when it comes to like intentional food restriction or intentional dieting, intentional under eating, it usually falls in one of those 3 different categories, whether it's dietary restriction, calorie restriction, or time restriction. Now, let me take a step back and help you guys realize that none of these things are bad. These are not bad strategies, bad protocols. I just am bringing light to the fact that, hey, these protocols are probably only appropriate for certain people at certain times. And for somebody that's already under eating, they have no business going into further intentional restriction. Yes, even if you have weight to lose or body fat to lose, it may not be appropriate to go into this intentional restriction if you're already under eating, right? It's like, you're already tried that trick, and is it working for you? Obviously not. We need a different tool then, right? It's like if you're already trying to like eat the least and move the most, and then you're trying to jump to a different diet, it's like, what are we doing? It's like, it's probably not going to work a different time if you just put a different face on it. We need a completely different plan, right? So there is some under eating tendencies that come from intentional dieting or intentional restriction, either through dietary restriction, caloric restriction, or time restriction. All the same thing. There's also another definition of under eating that comes a little bit more like accidental. So sometimes I call this like accidental under eating or unintentional under eating. And this is more around the hustle and grind culture that is so prominent for, again, women as well too. There's no shortage of women putting everybody else's needs above their own, whether it's family or children or work. They are overscheduled, and because of being overscheduled, their needs go on the back burner, and one of the first ones of those being food, right? So when I call like unintentional under eating or accidental under eating is really like when you're running out the door and you only have time for a coffee or a yogurt for breakfast. It's like, okay, and then that fuels into a day where I got so busy that I just like worked my way through lunch, or I grabbed a salad. Right? And then instead of like a mid-afternoon snack or something when their energy plummets, they grab another cup of coffee or an energy drink because it's 0 calories and 0 sugar. And then they get home at the end of the day and they're the ones standing at the kitchen island eating and shoveling dinner into their face while the rest of the family sits and enjoys the meal, and they're up like moving, doing, and being, right? It's like, oh my goodness, like that routine sounds incredibly stressful, and to your body, even if you don't perceive it, you're like, oh yeah, but that's just normal for me. It's like, yeah, but normal doesn't mean that your body digs it. It doesn't mean that your body's not noticing and compensating appropriately. So we can't just like let ourselves get overcome by this wave of hustle and grind culture, and all of a sudden now it's glorified to work through meals, skip meals, grab meals that actually are a snack and call it good, right? It's like your body is stressed AF, right? And that's where cortisol level goes up, body composition changes, menstrual cycles changes, our hormones go haywire, our gut health goes haywire, we're at a greater risk of autoimmune patterns. All of these things start to snowball and plummet, and it's like, oh, so if I go back to the root of the root of the root, though, like it started with me not prioritizing my own needs and underfueling. Yes, it did, right? So that's where we can't go any farther. And a lot of people are like, what should I do for my hormones? I'm like, we gotta eat. It's like, yeah, but what like supplement can I take? I'm like, it ain't gonna do shit unless you have the foundational pieces in play first. Then we can talk about strategic supplements or functional lab panels, but it's like you have to start with that foundation first, or like, where are we going? So there is some accidental underfueling that can happen as well too. And then I would say the third kind of definition that we see with underfueling is what we call that low energy availability state. Usually this is a byproduct of more of that like female athlete triad type picture. So I do see this low energy availability in some young female athletes. I think it can also happen though in 20s, 30s, 40s for women that lean very, very heavily on exercise as either a form of like stress release or stress management, or as a way to try to manage or control their body composition. So it's not uncommon that we see different female athletes that can lose their menstrual cycle, right? Part of that hypothalamic amenorrhea picture. That is because of a chronic low energy availability. The body just shuts down reproduction because it doesn't feel like that is a necessary use of energy, and it wouldn't be smart or safe to bring another life form into the world in a low energy availability state. If a woman's body can't even support her own needs, then we're not going to support bringing another life into the world, right? So low energy availability can increase your risk of injury. It tends to delay recovery, impair performance or improvements. I don't know if you guys have ever seen, I know I have seen quite a bit, different athletes that like train and train and train and they never really get faster or they never get stronger or they deal with chronic injuries instead. Not just young female athletes, but like I'm talking about women that enjoy being active or women that enjoy competing either in like CrossFit or in marathons or half marathons or endurance events. And it's just like they hit this part where they're like, no matter what I do, like I feel like I can't get any performance improvements, probably a chronic low energy availability state. And again, this can happen at any age, especially with women that really like use exercise as a means of like stress release, or they use exercise as a means of like seeking control. If they feel out of control in life or they feel like life is very chaotic, a lot of times we try to grasp onto things we feel like we can hyper control, and exercise can be one of those. One of the quotes that I've literally heard from my client before is, my life feels out of control, so I hyper control food and exercise as a result. It's like, yes, we're onto something here, right? How is that working for you? It's like, not very well. Cool, then let's come up with a different plan. So many women develop severe hormonal imbalances because of chronic low energy availability. So it's like I said, the wacky thing about a lot of these scenarios is that the intentional or unintentional undereating can lead to patterns of overeating very, very easily, right? And so we often normalize these behaviors though, because we give ourselves the permission of like cheat meals or cheat days, or we shame ourselves into these like appetite swings by identifying them or calling them like, oh, I'm a binge eater, or I just lack willpower. It's like, do you, or are you just under fueling 90% of the time, binging 10% of the time, and then wondering why you're not making any forward progress? It's very, very common that our body is on to what we're doing, right? It's smart. It's always 3 steps ahead of us. So if we're chronically or intentionally or unintentionally under fueling in certain areas of our life, of course we're going to have moments where we feel out of control around food or we binge around food. And that's, like I said, not necessarily something that we need to like label or shame. It's like, we just need to call a spade. And it's like, if you feel like you need a cheat meal to go big, or you need a cheat day, or your body feels like it needs a binge, or you feel out of control around food, like that's probably telling us something bigger. It's not about that event. It's about what's happening before that event even starts or triggers, right? It's like what triggered that event, right? So that way we don't carry the guilt and the shame and things that really correlate with that. So every single cellular and metabolic process in our body requires energy, which we can only get from consistent fuel on board, aka food. And when this isn't consistent or reliable source, the body does get stuck in that survival mode, and it has to start the process of compensating somewhere, which then appears as different symptoms and eventually as different disease states, right? So yes, I am going bold. I'm going out on the limb and letting people know that there are certain chronic disease states out there that are being triggered by, and at the root of them is chronic undereating patterns. Do we hear a whole lot of doctors talking about that? Hell no, because that's kind of reserved for a little bit more of like a functional medicine type of approach, and not necessarily like a Band-Aid approach, right? Where you'll walk into a doctor's office and they automatically see that you're struggling with weight and they automatically say, eat less, move more. It's like, really? Do I fit in that box though? Or do I have times of undereating, but then times of overeating? So really at the root of what's triggering the overeating is the undereating, right? It's like, yes, it is, people. So once we start to put kind of the bigger picture and the piece of the puzzle together, we can start to really come to the table and get like a true root cause approach here, instead of just spinning our wheels and trying like more restriction because it's like, it worked the first time, right? It's like, nope, it never did. So I'll just try it harder. It's like, I give up, like face palm, right? We got to find a different way. It's not working. So I think some of like the big picture highlights that I want to leave you guys with around this undereating conversation, so that you can start to really like give it its full time in the sun here, is thinking about some of like the harmful effects of underfueling, not just like not and feeling lethargic and having daily digestive issues and menstrual cycle imbalances, like the physical stuff, yes, that's enough of, like I said, a nuisance. But I'm talking about like the harmful effects that become more even psychosocial and extend far beyond even just some of the physical manifestations that I work with a lot in my practice as well too. So I think some of the harmful effects of undereating that often go unsaid or unnoticed from like a psychological perspective is this tendency towards inflexible thinking or obsessive thoughts, right? So this is what then fuels the perfect person that latches onto different diets, right? Because we have more of this like obsessive, inflexible thinking. It has to be black and it has to be white. It has to be good or it has to be bad. It has to be allowed or it has to be not allowed. And it's like they want parameters. They want rules, right? And it's like, that's more of kind of like a chronic undereating pattern because there's a lot of anxiety, shame, and fear wrapped around food. So they feel like they need a box. They need boundaries. They need parameters. They couldn't possibly trust themselves without like a box to live around, right? Or rules or a set of macros or a set of calories. It's like, yeah, that's probably a sign that we're kind of chronically underfueling. Also see in these people difficulty making decisions or impaired concentration, a lot of brain fog in that underfueling tendency, dreams about food, recurring thoughts about food or body image or just eating in general, obsession with what other people are eating. So you might even start to identify this in people around you, because I know that in working with certain individuals, when they become more healed, they start to recognize some of these symptoms in other people. And they recognize, they're like, yeah, whenever I'm around my sister, she's always so obsessed with like what I'm eating, why I'm eating it. And like, I'm just chill about it now. Like I know exactly, I have an intention, I have a plan, I know exactly what I'm doing and what feels best for me. And she's just like all up in my grill and super judgy about what I'm eating or not eating. I'm like, yep, that's an unhealed person, right? You're starting to identify now, like they have their own shit that they haven't dealt with yet. And so because of that, they're going to start to make comments about you. And they're going to really have a lot of that like self-comparison game because they don't trust what they're doing. They don't have a confident plan and a confident approach like you do. So they're constantly second guessing themselves. From an emotional aspect with these individuals, you see, like I said, a lot of shame, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety. And that really stems from, again, like the rigidity around routine. They feel like they have to have routine. They have to have like everything planned out. There's no spontaneity. They get very anxious if they don't exactly know what the food situation is going to be. They get more fear and anxiety around not being able to control their food or their food intake, especially around different social events that involve food. You also see in this situation like low mood, a lot of depression, emotional dysregulation, kind of disassociation happening. A lot of that just being because like there's not enough energy on board. We're not creating a lot of those neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, epinephrine, norepinephrine, all of those things that kind of feedback loop to the brain and kind of create like our personality and emotions and highs and lows. Like that just goes by the wayside, right? Because there's just not enough energy on board. The other thing that, again, I'll go out on the limb and I'll be a bold person to say this, the undereating does leave you more vulnerable to other neurological conditions such as PTSD, OCD, ADD, ADHD. All of those things make you more vulnerable to developing those types of additional neurological conditions as well too. So pretty crazy stuff. Difficulty controlling emotions, emotional numbness, right? We also see like increased focus on themselves. So these people might even be dubbed as like selfish individuals, right? There's this whole like concept of self-protection that's coming into play. Like their brain feels like, holy shit, there's not enough resources on board on a consistent basis. I still have to keep this person upright. I need to turn internal and I need to focus in on like self-protection at all costs. So that's where these individuals might kind of like disassociate, self-isolate, increase focus on themselves as a method of protection there. Inability to fully engage in conversation, pretty much usually due to preoccupation with like food or exercise or mood changes. Social functioning is disrupted, probably not a shocker to any of you, but really due to like heightened need for routine and predictability, avoidance, or the inability to relax, especially at different events where food is present. But I see this quite a bit where individuals, like I'll try to get them to start like some breathwork practices or some down regulating practices, and they'll come back and they're like, I can't do that. I'm like, well, there's probably a sign that your brain like can't relax, because it feels like, no, I can't relax because like we're under fueled. Like we got to eat now. We need resources. Like, let's go. Lots of different, like I said, avoidance tendencies, even like avoiding some of those social events around food, low self-esteem, low self-worth. You can kind of feel a lot of these types of things starting to come out. And I'm not saying that it's 100% of an underfueling pattern. I'm saying that the underfueling pattern tends to be one of those body first stressors that contributes to a lot of these also like mental health type symptoms. So in the bigger picture, I just want you guys to recognize, like, is there some physical signs and symptoms of underfueling, like losing my period or infertility or bone degeneration and tooth decay and constipation and bloating and digestive issues like IBS or SIBO, or losing my hunger fullness cues and wasting away my muscle, my hair starting to thin, my skin is super dry, I'm always cold, I'm depressed, I'm anxious, I can't sleep, my basal body temperature drops, I have low heart rate and low blood pressure. Of course, there's going to be all these physical symptoms, right? But the physical symptoms, I want you guys to recognize that those physical symptoms also then exacerbate mental symptoms. So for individuals that are like seeking mental health care without addressing the underfueling pattern that's triggering that, they tend to spin their wheels and things like that. And I only say that because I feel like there's a lot of teamwork that needs to happen between like the physical health space and the mental health space, because the mental health space is limited on their resources to be able to overcome the physical body stressor, right? If you're a therapist of any regard, try talking rationally or giving someone some rational tools to regulate their emotions if they're hungry, or they're underfueled, or their body thinks that they're constantly being chased by a lion and they're under stress. Like, you're not going to tap into a rational brain. You're not going to be able to equip that person with any sort of tools or resources to regulate their emotions until you tackle the physical body. So it's like, I wish that like every mental health therapist also worked with a nutritionist, right? So that those two worlds can really combine together, because now I can present somebody in a calm, cool, and relaxed place. And it's like, now let's work on our mental regulation tools, or kind of come to the table and see how do we feel when some of those physical stressors are off the table, right? I mean, I even just got an email today from a gal who said, I was talking to my husband last night and I feel like I got my life back. Thank you so much for your guidance and resources that you've given me. It's like, okay, right? Someone that had debilitating anxiety, chronic digestive issues, chronic constipation. And it's like, I didn't realize how much of my mental health was my physical health. So that's the seed I want to plant for you guys here too, with this kind of like under eating type of conversation. If you feel like this conversation has resonated with you, or you feel like you may be kind of in this camp, or you know somebody that might be in this camp, feel free obviously to share this with them. I think it would be very beneficial. If you're looking for some help and some guidance through this process, I would direct you towards my Master Your Metabolism Masterclass course. That is a completely self-paced course. You can start it at any time. And here coming up in the month of November, I'm going to be doing a little bit more around that Master Your Metabolism course with some bonus opportunities as well too. So if you jump into the Master Your Metabolism course now, you'll have access to some bonus opportunities that will come with that course here in November. So if that's, like I said, an underfueling picture has been your demise, I would start to get a jump start on what does it look like to fuel myself properly? How do I relearn my relationship with food and not just get stuck in this like eat less, move more type of definition that everybody tries to put myself in. So Master Your Metabolism Masterclass, you can head to the link in my bio and you'll see that as the second option down when you click on the link in my bio. Master Your Metabolism Masterclass will take you over to my platform of Renew University, where you can start that fun journey of relearning your nutritional foundation. So hopefully, like I said, this was something that resonated with you guys, and we'll dive into more specifics on next week's Learn with Lo.